Marcus Holloway was scraping rust off his tractor when he heard the whirring sound overhead, followed by a crash that would change his life forever. The small drone tumbled through the branches of his grandfather's oak tree, its rotors spinning helplessly as it dangled 30 feet above the ground. He didn't know the quiet woman standing at his fence line was recording everything. He didn't know she was documenting rural America's forgotten corners for a documentary that would reach millions. He didn't know that climbing that tree to help a stranger would transform his failing farm into something extraordinary. But as he looked up at the trapped machine, one question burned in his mind. Could a simple act of kindness bridge the gap between his crumbling world and opportunities beyond his wildest dreams? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Holloway farm as Marcus wiped grease from his calloused hands with a rag that had seen better days. The old International Harvester tractor sat silent in the barn, its engine parts scattered across a workbench like the fragments of his family's legacy. 3 generations of Holloways had worked this land, but Marcus feared he might be the last. The bank notice tucked into his back pocket felt heavier than the wrench in his grip, a constant reminder that foreclosure loomed just 2 months away. The property stretched across 160 acres of rolling hills in southeastern Ohio, where corn once grew tall and cattle grazed in peaceful contentment. Now, weeds choked the fields, and the red barns paint peeled like sunburned skin. The farmhouse where Marcus had been born 34 years ago creaked with every wind, its foundation settling deeper into the earth as if trying to hide from the weight of mounting debt and broken dreams. Marcus had inherited more than land from his grandfather William. He had inherited the stubborn pride that ran through Holloway blood like sap through maple trees. Even as creditors circled and neighbors whispered about the farm's inevitable demise, he refused to consider selling to developers who saw dollar signs where he saw home. Every morning, he rose before dawn to tend the few remaining livestock and patch whatever had broken during the night, fighting a battle he knew he was losing but couldn't bring himself to surrender. The drone's mechanical buzzing cut through the afternoon quiet like a chainsaw through silk. Marcus looked up from his tractor repair to see the small aircraft hovering above his property, its camera gimbal rotating with purposeful precision. He had grown accustomed to curious visitors over the years. City folks who drove their shiny cars down his gravel driveway to gawk at rural poverty like tourists at a roadside attraction. Some came with cameras, others with clipboards and fake sympathy, but all left the same way they arrived, unchanged and unmoved by what they witnessed. The drone operator stood just beyond his property line, a woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested she spent more time outdoors than in boardrooms. Her equipment bag bore the scuffs and stains of frequent travel, and she handled the drone controller with the confidence of someone who had navigated countless aerial shots. Marcus noticed she didn't wave or call out a greeting, simply focused on her work with professional detachment that both impressed and irritated him. A sudden gust of wind caught the drone just as it maneuvered between the branches of the massive oak tree that had shaded the Holloway farmhouse for over a century. The aircraft lurched sideways, its rotors clipping against autumn leaves, before becoming entangled in a web of branches 25 feet above the ground. The high-pitched whine of motors struggling against resistance filled the air before falling silent, leaving the drone suspended like a modern scarecrow in the ancient tree. Marcus watched the woman's shoulders sag as she lowered her controller, the professional mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine frustration beneath. She approached the fence line cautiously, as if crossing into foreign territory where her urban credentials carried no weight. Her voice carried the flat accent of the Midwest when she finally spoke, pitched just loud enough to bridge the distance between them. "Excuse me," she called, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm really sorry about this. Is there any way you might have a ladder tall enough to reach my equipment?" Marcus set down his wrench and walked toward the fence, his boots crunching through fallen leaves that rustled like whispered secrets. The woman was smaller than she had appeared from a distance, but her eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to navigating uncomfortable situations. Her camera equipment suggested she worked in media, probably another journalist looking to document rural decline for an audience that would tisk-tisk over their morning coffee before forgetting the story by lunch. "Ladder won't reach that high," Marcus replied, studying the drone's precarious position among branches thick as his waist. "That old oak's been growing since before my grandfather was born. Tallest ladder I've got would leave you 15 feet short." The woman's face fell, and she glanced at her expensive equipment with the look of someone calculating both financial loss and professional setback. Marcus recognized that expression. He had worn it himself many times over the past few years, as one piece of farm machinery after another failed beyond his ability to repair. The vulnerability in her posture stirred something in him that had nothing to do with neighborly obligation, and everything to do with understanding what it meant to watch important things slip away. "I suppose I could call the fire department," she said, though her tone suggested she knew how that conversation would unfold. Rural fire departments dealt with real emergencies, not the mishaps of outsiders who flew expensive toys without permission. Marcus studied the tree with the practiced eye of someone who had climbed its branches as a boy and knew every foothold by heart. The oak had served as his childhood refuge, a place to escape chores and dream about adventures beyond the farm's boundaries. Its bark bore the scars of countless storms, yet it stood firm against whatever nature hurled its way, much like the Holloway family itself. "I can get it down for you," he heard himself saying, the words emerging before his practical mind could intervene with sensible objections. The woman's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You don't have to do that. I mean, it's not your problem." But Marcus was already walking toward the tree, driven by instincts that had nothing to do with helping strangers and everything to do with proving to himself that he hadn't given up entirely. If he could rescue her drone, perhaps he could rescue other things that seemed beyond salvation. The symbolism wasn't lost on him, though he kept such thoughts to himself. "Might as well," he said over his shoulder. "Been meaning to check those upper branches anyway. Storm last month might have loosened some deadwood." The first 15 feet of climbing came easily, muscle memory guiding his hands to familiar handholds where bark had worn smooth from decades of young Holloway boys seeking higher ground. The oak's trunk was massive enough that Marcus could wrap his arms only halfway around its circumference, and its lower branches spread like welcoming arms to support his weight. He had forgotten the peaceful perspective that height provided, the way his troubles seemed smaller when viewed from above the everyday world. As he climbed higher, the branches grew thinner and the wind more noticeable, stirring leaves that whispered warnings about the folly of middle-aged men attempting boyhood feats. The drone hung just within reach, its sleek carbon fiber body looking alien against the organic curves of bark and leaf. Marcus could see the woman below, her face turned upward with an expression caught between gratitude and concern for his safety. "Careful up there," she called, her professional detachment giving way to genuine worry. "It's not worth getting hurt over." But Marcus had already committed to the rescue, and Holloway pride demanded he see it through regardless of personal risk. He stretched toward the drone, feeling the branch beneath his feet flex under his weight. His fingers brushed against the aircraft's landing gear, and he adjusted his position for a better grip, aware that one wrong move could send both him and the expensive equipment tumbling to the ground. The drone came free with surprising ease, its rotors having been held more by tangled leaves than solid branches. Marcus cradled it against his chest like a rescued bird, marveling at its lightweight construction and the complexity of its camera assembly. This was no toy, but a professional tool worth thousands of dollars, the kind of equipment that represented serious investment and serious work. The descent proved more challenging than the climb, requiring careful coordination to protect both himself and the drone from damage. Each step downward demanded attention to foot placement and weight distribution, while fallen leaves made the bark treacherous in places where autumn moisture had created slick patches. The woman watched his progress with visible tension, her hands clasped as if preparing to catch whatever might fall. When Marcus finally reached the ground, his shirt was damp with perspiration and decorated with bark fragments that clung like natural confetti. The woman approached with obvious relief, her professional composure momentarily forgotten in the face of genuine gratitude. She accepted the drone with hands that trembled slightly, examining it for damage with the thoroughness of someone whose livelihood depended on such equipment. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice carrying warmth that hadn't been present during their initial exchange. "This would have been a disaster for my project timeline. Marcus dusted bark from his sleeves and tried to ignore the way her smile transformed her entire appearance from distant professional to approachable human being. What kind of project requires aerial photography of rundown farms? The question hung between them for a moment, and he could see her weighing how much to reveal to a stranger who had just done her an unexpected kindness. Her equipment bag bore labels from various production companies, and her camera bore the scuffs of extensive travel, suggesting work that took her far from whatever office she called home. "Documentary work," she said finally. "I'm filming stories about rural America, places that used to be the backbone of this country but are struggling now." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at the familiar refrain. Every few months, another journalist or filmmaker arrived to document rural decline, as if poverty were a tourist attraction. They came with predetermined narratives about the death of small-town America, interviewed carefully selected locals who confirmed their assumptions, then departed to present their findings to urban audiences, who nodded knowingly about problems they had no intention of addressing. "Let me guess," he said, his tone cooling perceptibly. "You're here to show how we poor country folks are victims of forces beyond our control. Maybe get some footage of me looking defeated next to broken-down equipment." The woman's expression shifted, revealing a flash of something that might have been hurt, or possibly annoyance. She shouldered her equipment bag with practiced efficiency, the moment of connection between them evaporating like morning dew under harsh sunlight. "Actually, no," she replied, her professional distance reasserting itself. "I'm here because stories like yours matter more than most people realize. But I understand why you'd be suspicious." She turned to leave, then paused and reached into her jacket pocket. "My name is Claire Richardson. I know you don't owe me anything beyond what you've already done, but if you're ever interested in hearing what I'm really trying to accomplish, my contact information is on this card." Marcus accepted the business card without looking at it, his attention focused on the woman's face as she spoke. There was something in her eyes that suggested personal investment rather than professional detachment, a quality that distinguished her from the parade of outsiders who had visited his farm over the years. "I'm Marcus Holloway," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that felt both formal and surprisingly natural. "This is my family's land, or at least it is for now." Claire's handshake was firm and brief, her skin softer than he had expected, but marked with small calluses that suggested she handled her own equipment rather than directing others to do so. "Thank you again, Marcus. You saved my day, possibly my whole project schedule." After she left, Marcus found himself standing in the same spot where their conversation had taken place, turning her business card over in his fingers without really reading it. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the oak's branches, casting shadows that shifted and danced with each breath of wind. His tractor sat waiting in the barn, its repair half finished and growing more urgent with each passing day. But he remained motionless beneath the tree where he had just performed an act of kindness for a stranger. The farm stretched around him in all directions, a landscape that held every memory of his 34 years, but offered little hope for his future. The cornfields that had once waved golden in autumn winds now stood empty except for stubborn weeds that thrived where crops had failed. The pastures where cattle had grazed contentedly were vacant except for the ghosts of better times and the growing weight of unpaid bills. Marcus finally looked at Claire's business card, noting the simple design and quality paper that suggested success without ostentation. Her title read, "Documentary Producer," followed by contact information and the name of a production company he didn't recognize. Below that, handwritten in careful script, she had added, "Stories worth telling," as if that phrase explained everything about her purpose and methods. The next few weeks passed in the familiar rhythm of failing farm life, each day bringing new challenges that required increasingly creative solutions. Marcus repaired his tractor using parts salvaged from other broken equipment, patched holes in his barn roof with whatever materials he could afford, and counted every dollar twice before spending it on necessities. The bank notice remained in his back pocket like a paperweight, growing softer from handling but no less threatening in its implications. He thought about Claire Richardson more often than he cared to admit, wondering what her documentary would reveal about rural America and whether she possessed the insight to see beyond surface poverty to the deeper currents that, quote, shaped country life. Most outsiders focused on obvious symbols of decline, the rusted equipment and peeling paint that confirmed their preconceptions about rural failure. But they missed the stubborn resilience that kept people fighting long after rational minds would have surrendered. The email arrived on a Thursday morning while Marcus was reviewing his finances at the kitchen table, trying to determine which bills could be delayed another month without catastrophic consequences. His laptop, a second-hand machine that moved with glacial slowness, chimed with the unfamiliar sound of incoming mail. He rarely received electronic correspondence beyond spam and occasional notes from distant relatives who had escaped rural life for urban opportunities. Claire Richardson's message appeared in his inbox like an unexpected gift, its subject line reading simply, "Thank you and an opportunity." Marcus opened it with curiosity mixed with wariness, expecting either a generic thank you note or a request for cooperation with her documentary project. What he found instead defied both expectations and fundamentally altered his understanding of their brief encounter. The message began with genuine gratitude for his assistance with the drone rescue, but quickly moved to explain the deeper purpose behind her visit to his farm. Claire had been documenting rural stories across 7 states, collecting footage for a documentary series that would air on a major streaming platform with global reach. Her focus wasn't rural decline, but rural resilience, the untold stories of people who refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming challenges. Marcus read the email twice before its full implications registered in his mind. The drone footage had captured not just his farm's physical condition, but the act of rescue itself, creating what Claire described as a perfect example of rural character in action. She had submitted preliminary footage to her production partners, who had responded with enthusiasm for a full episode centered on his story and the broader themes it represented. The potential impact overwhelmed him as he continued reading. Claire outlined plans for extensive filming over several weeks, interviews with Marcus and his neighbors, and historical research into the Holloway family's century-long connection to the land. The documentary would air as part of a series called Forgotten Foundations that aimed to showcase rural America's continuing relevance to national identity and economic stability. But the most stunning revelation came in the email's final paragraphs. Claire's production company had partnered with a nonprofit organization that connected struggling rural operations with urban donors, investors, and volunteer organizations. Previous documentary subjects had received financial assistance, equipment donations, and ongoing support that transformed their circumstances from desperate to hopeful. Marcus pushed back from the kitchen table and walked to the window that overlooked his grandfather's oak tree, its branches now bare except for a few stubborn leaves that refused to accept autumn's verdict. The tree had witnessed 4 generations of Holloway struggles and triumphs, had shaded celebrations and mourned losses, had stood firm while everything else changed around it. Perhaps it was fitting that salvation had literally fallen from its branches in the form of an expensive drone and an unexpected opportunity. His first instinct was skepticism born from years of disappointment and false promises. Too many people had offered help that evaporated when they realized the true scope of his challenges, and too many opportunities had proven to be elaborate deceptions designed to exploit rural desperation. But something in Claire's email tone suggested genuine commitment rather than casual interest, and her detailed knowledge of rural issues indicated research beyond superficial understanding. Marcus spent the rest of the morning researching Claire Richardson and her production company, using his slow internet connection to verify her credentials and examine her previous work. What he discovered reinforced the positive impression she had made during their brief meeting. Her documentaries had won awards for their sensitive portrayal of working-class subjects, and her production company maintained partnerships with legitimate charitable organizations that provided follow-up support for featured subjects. The weight of possibility settled on his shoulders like a coat he wasn't sure he deserved to wear. For months, he had prepared himself for the inevitable loss of his family's farm, had made peace with the idea that he would be the Holloway who finally surrendered to forces beyond his control. Now, Claire offered a different narrative, one in which his struggles became the foundation for renewal rather than defeat. He responded to her email that afternoon, his fingers moving slowly across the keyboard as he crafted words that felt inadequate to express his mixture of gratitude, hope, and lingering uncertainty. He agreed to participate in her documentary project while maintaining realistic expectations about its potential impact on his circumstances. If nothing else, perhaps his story would inspire other rural families to persevere through their own challenges. Claire's response arrived within hours, filled with enthusiasm and detailed plans for the filming process. She would return to his farm the following week with a small crew to begin comprehensive documentation of his daily life and the broader context of rural challenges. The production would unfold over several weeks, allowing time for interviews with neighbors, local officials, and historians who could provide perspective on the region's agricultural heritage. The prospect of hosting a film crew on his failing farm triggered anxiety that Marcus hadn't anticipated. His daily reality included embarrassing moments of mechanical failure, financial stress, and the constant pressure of pending foreclosure. The idea of having such struggles documented for public consumption felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like standing naked before strangers who would judge both his body and his character. But beneath the anxiety lay something he had nearly forgotten: excitement about the future that extended beyond mere survival. For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to imagine scenarios in which his farm not only survived but thrived, where the Holloway legacy continued into a fifth generation instead of ending with his defeat. The transformation from despair to hope felt fragile and precious, like a seedling that required careful protection from harsh weather. Claire arrived the following Monday with a crew of 3, their equipment van navigating his gravel driveway with the careful precision of city drivers unaccustomed to rural roads. Marcus watched from his porch as they unloaded cameras, sound equipment, and lighting gear that probably cost more than his annual income, feeling simultaneously honored and overwhelmed by their professional attention to his amateur story. The filming process proved more natural than he had expected, partly due to Claire's skill at putting subjects at ease, and partly because his daily routine continued regardless of camera presence. He milked his remaining cows, repaired fence posts damaged by recent storms, and worked on his tractor's transmission, while the crew documented each activity with unobtrusive efficiency. Claire conducted the formal interview in his kitchen, the same room where 4 generations of Holloway women had fed their families, and 4 generations of Holloway men had planned their futures. The questions she asked revealed deep understanding of rural life's complexities, moving beyond surface hardships to explore the emotional and cultural factors that kept people connected to land that offered more challenges than rewards. "What keeps you fighting when everything seems stacked against you?" she asked, her camera operator adjusting angles to capture both Marcus's words and the kitchen's authentic details. Marcus considered the question while gazing through the window at his grandfather's oak tree, its bare branches reaching toward a sky that promised winter's approach. "I suppose it's because giving up feels like betraying everyone who came before me. My great-grandfather cleared this land with hand tools and a team of horses. My grandfather survived a scene. Depression by growing food for neighbors, who paid with labor instead of money. My father kept the farm going through the farm crisis of the 80s, when half our neighbors lost everything." He paused, searching for words that could convey the weight of inherited responsibility without sounding melodramatic or self-pitying. "This land holds all of their dreams and all of their sacrifices. When I walk through these fields, I'm walking where they walked, working toward the same goals they worked toward. Selling out to developers would erase all of that history, turn their legacy into just another strip mall or subdivision." End quote. Claire's follow-up questions explored the tension between honoring the past and facing practical realities, between romantic attachment to land and the harsh mathematics of agricultural economics. Marcus found himself articulating thoughts he had never fully formed, giving voice to emotions that usually remained buried beneath the daily demands of survival. The crew spent 3 days documenting his routine, interviewing neighbors who remembered the farm in better times, and filming the landscape that had shaped the Holloway family story. They captured sunrise over his fields, the golden light that had greeted every generation of his family, and sunset behind his barn, the peaceful conclusion to countless days of hard work and simple satisfaction. On their final day, Claire sat with Marcus beneath the oak tree where their relationship had begun, both of them looking up at branches that had sheltered their first conversation and launched their unlikely partnership. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's fire and the earthy promise of approaching winter. "I want you to know that whatever happens with the documentary, you've already succeeded in ways that matter more than money or fame," Claire said, her professional manner giving way to personal warmth. "You've preserved something valuable in a world that seems determined to discard everything that doesn't generate immediate profit." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks at the unexpected praise, unaccustomed to having his choices viewed as admirable rather than stubbornly impractical. "I've been thinking about what you said in your email, about rural resilience being more important than rural decline. Maybe that's what I've been doing all along without realizing it." Claire smiled and gathered her equipment for the final time, but her departure felt different from their first meeting. Instead of saying goodbye to a stranger who had provided temporary assistance, Marcus was bidding farewell to someone who had become invested in his story and committed to sharing it with audiences who needed to understand rural America's continuing relevance. The weeks following the filming crew's departure passed with unusual anticipation as Marcus returned to his normal routine, while imagining how that routine would appear to viewers who had never experienced farm life. He found himself seeing his daily activities through fresh eyes, noticing details that had become invisible through familiarity, and recognizing the subtle skills that rural life required, but rarely celebrated. The documentary's release date approached with gathering momentum, as Claire kept him informed about the editing process, network approval, and promotional plans. The streaming platform had scheduled Forgotten Foundations for release during prime viewing season, with Marcus's episode positioned prominently in the series lineup. The promotional materials featured images of his farm and quotes from his interview, transforming his private struggles into public inspiration. 3 days before the documentary's premiere, Claire called with news that surpassed even his most optimistic expectations. The advanced screening had generated significant response from viewers, critics, and potential supporters who wanted to help rural families like his own. A non-profit organization that specialized in agricultural preservation had reached out offering grants for equipment and infrastructure improvements, while individual donors had contributed to a fund specifically designated for the Holloway Farm's revival. "I have to tell you, Marcus, I've never seen response like this to any of my previous work," Claire said, her excitement evident even through the phone's imperfect connection. "People are really connecting with your story, with what you represent about American values and determination." The numbers she quoted seemed fictional to Marcus, who had grown accustomed to measuring success in terms of bills paid rather than dreams realized. The combined donations and grants would cover his outstanding debts, fund necessary equipment repairs, and provide operating capital for the following growing season. More importantly, they would allow him to keep the farm in the family and begin planning for expansion rather than mere survival. The documentary premiered on a Thursday evening, and Marcus watched it alone in his kitchen while November wind rattled the windows and reminded him that winter was approaching whether he was ready or not. Seeing his life translated into professional documentary format felt surreal, like watching actors portray his family's story with uncanny accuracy. Claire had captured not just the surface details of his daily routine, but the emotional undercurrents that motivated his persistence in the face of overwhelming challenges. The interview segments revealed thoughts and feelings he rarely expressed even to himself, while the landscape footage transformed his familiar surroundings into something approaching art. But the most powerful moment came when the cameras had captured his rescue of Claire's drone, the spontaneous act of kindness that had initiated their entire relationship. Watching himself climb the oak tree to help a stranger, Marcus realized that the moment represented everything Claire had said about rural character and values that transcended economic circumstances. The documentary's impact exceeded all expectations, generating social media buzz, critical acclaim, and most importantly, continuing support from viewers who felt personally invested in Marcus's success. The nonprofit organization that had offered initial funding expanded their commitment to include long-term mentorship and market connections that would help him rebuild his operation on sustainable foundations. Within 6 months, the Holloway farm had transformed from a symbol of rural decline into a model of rural renewal. Marcus used the donated funds to repair his equipment, restore his fields, and implement sustainable farming practices that attracted additional support from environmental organizations. The oak tree where he had rescued Claire's drone became a landmark that visitors asked to see, a physical reminder of how small acts of kindness could generate life-changing consequences. Claire returned the following spring to film a follow-up segment documenting the farm's revival and the broader impact of the documentary series on rural communities across America. She found Marcus working in fields that green with promise, his equipment running smoothly, and his face bearing the expression of someone who had rediscovered hope without losing the humility that had made his story compelling in the first place. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't climbed that tree?" she asked, setting up her camera beneath the oak's spreading branches, now full with new leaves that whispered secrets about resilience and renewal. Marcus paused in his work to consider the question, his hands resting on the handle of a hoe that had belonged to his grandfather and would someday belong to his own children if he was blessed with them. The farm stretched around him in all directions, no longer a burden to be endured, but a legacy to be celebrated and passed forward to future generations. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead in lazy spirals that seemed to bless the land below. "But I figure things happened the way they were supposed to happen. You needed help, I was able to provide it, and somehow that simple exchange opened doors neither of us could have imagined." He gestured toward the fields, where corn was beginning to show green shoots that promised a successful harvest. Toward the barn where his repaired equipment sat ready for whatever challenges the growing season might bring. Toward the house where 4 generations of Holloways had raised their families and dreamed their dreams. "My grandfather used to say that farming was an act of faith, planting seeds in spring without knowing what autumn would bring," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust in possibilities beyond immediate vision. "I guess helping you was another kind of planting, putting good intentions out into the world without knowing what might grow from them." Claire smiled and adjusted her camera settings to capture the golden light that painted the landscape with the warmth of late afternoon sun. The same light that had illuminated countless farming generations and would continue to bless the land long after they were gone. "I think your grandfather would be proud of the harvest you've managed to cultivate." As the sun set behind the restored barn and painted the sky in shades of hope and satisfaction, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from near despair to renewed purpose. The oak tree stood sentinel over the scene, its branches reaching toward stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, ancient witness to the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that defined both farming and life itself. The documentary had launched other episodes featuring rural families across America, each story building on the themes of resilience and renewal that Marcus's experience had established. Claire's production company had expanded its partnerships with charitable organizations, creating a network of support that connected urban resources with rural needs in ways that benefited both communities. Letters arrived daily from viewers who had been inspired by Marcus's story to support rural causes, visit family farms, or reconsider their own relationships with the land that ultimately sustained all human life. Children wrote school reports about his experience, while college students chose agricultural careers they might never have considered without exposure to the documentary's message about farming's continuing relevance. The Holloway farm had become more than a working agricultural operation. It had evolved into a symbol of what was possible when people refused to surrender to circumstances beyond their immediate control. Marcus established programs that welcomed urban visitors who wanted to understand rural life, creating educational opportunities that bridged the gap between city and country while generating additional income for the farm's operations. On quiet evenings when the day's work was finished and the farm settled into peaceful silence, Marcus often sat beneath the oak tree where his adventure had begun and marveled at the chain of events that had transformed his life. A moment of simple kindness toward a stranger had generated consequences that rippled far beyond his individual circumstances, touching lives across the nation and around the world. The tree's branches, now full with summer's abundance, provided shade for his contemplation and shelter for the birds whose songs filled the evening air with music that had accompanied every generation of his family. The drone rescue that had seemed like such a small gesture at the time had proven to be the pivotal moment that separated his story's tragic ending from its triumphant new beginning. As autumn returned and the anniversary of Claire's first visit approached, Marcus prepared to welcome her back for another follow-up segment that would document the farm's continued growth and the expanding impact of rural renewal programs inspired by his example. The fields that had once stood empty now waved with healthy crops. The buildings that had suffered from neglect now stood proudly maintained. And the family legacy that had seemed destined for termination now stretched confidently toward future generations. The evening before Claire's scheduled arrival, Marcus climbed the oak tree one final time, not to rescue expensive equipment, but to gain the perspective that height provided on the landscape of his life. From 30 feet above the ground, he could see the entirety of his property, the neighboring farms that were beginning their own renewal processes, and the distant lights of town where urban dwellers were learning to appreciate rural contributions to their daily lives. The view reminded him that individual stories were part of larger narratives, that personal struggles contributed to collective understanding, and that simple acts of kindness could generate transformative consequences that extended far beyond their original intentions. His rescue of Claire's drone had been motivated by nothing more complicated than neighborly helpfulness, but it had evolved into something approaching miracle. Claire arrived the next morning with the same small crew that had documented his stories beginning, their equipment van once again navigating the gravel driveway that now led to prosperity instead of poverty. But this time, Marcus greeted them as friends rather than strangers, his confidence reflecting the security that came from knowing his farm's future was assured and his family's legacy would continue. The final interview took place beneath the oak tree where their relationship had begun, both participants aware that they were concluding a story that had exceeded all their original expectations. Claire's questions focused on lessons learned and wisdom gained, on the transformation from near defeat to sustainable success, and on the broader implications of rural renewal for American society. What would you say to other rural families who are facing the same challenges you faced 2 years ago? She asked, her camera capturing both his words and the thriving landscape that provided visual testimony to his stories. Happy ending. Marcus considered the question while watching a family of hawks soar overhead, their graceful flight patterns reminding him that survival required both individual strength and community support. I'd tell them that giving up is always easier than holding on, but holding on creates possibilities that giving up never can. I'd tell them that help sometimes comes from unexpected directions, and that small acts of kindness towards strangers can open doors they never knew existed." End quote. He paused to gather his thoughts, aware that his words might reach families who were experiencing the same desperation he had felt just 2 years earlier. Most importantly, I'd tell them that their stories matter, that rural life contributes something essential to this country's character, and that there are people out there who understand that contribution and want to help preserve it. Claire concluded the interview with questions about the future, about Marcus's plans for the farm and his hopes for the next generation of rural Americans. His answers reflected the confidence of someone who had learned to trust in possibilities beyond immediate vision, while maintaining the humility that had made his story compelling in the first place. As the crew packed their equipment for the final time, Claire lingered beneath the oak tree where their unlikely partnership had begun. The afternoon sun filtered through leaves that rustled with the promise of another changing season, another cycle in the eternal rhythm that governed both farming and life itself. "Thank you," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of professional gratitude and personal affection. "You've given me more than just a great documentary subject. You've reminded me why I chose this work in the first place." Marcus shook her hand in farewell, remembering their first meeting when she had been a stranger with a damaged drone, and he had been a farmer facing foreclosure. The transformation in both their circumstances seemed almost magical, proof that narrative threads could weave together in patterns too complex for human planning, but perfect for human hope. After Claire's departure, Marcus returned to his evening routine, but with the satisfaction of someone whose story had reached its proper conclusion, while remaining open to new chapters yet to be written. The oak tree stood guard over his property, as it had for more than a century, its branches reaching towards stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and would continue to shine long after current troubles had been resolved. The Holloway farm thrived in the years that followed, becoming a model for rural renewal programs across the nation, and a destination for visitors who wanted to understand the connection between agricultural heritage and contemporary life. Marcus married a local teacher who shared his passion for rural preservation, and together they raised children who grew up knowing that their family's land represented more than mere property, but embodied the dreams and sacrifices of generations. The oak tree where the story had begun continued to grow, its rings marking each passing year, and its branches providing shade for new generations of Holloway children who would climb its trunk and dream their own dreams of adventure and achievement. The drone rescue that had seemed like such a small gesture had generated consequences that would ripple through time, touching lives not yet born and inspiring stories not yet told. On quiet evenings, when the farm work was finished and his family gathered around the kitchen table, where 4 generations had shared their meals and their hopes, Marcus sometimes told his children about the day a stranger's drone became tangled in their oak tree and how helping her had changed everything. The children listened with the patience of those who had heard the story many times, but never tired of its message about kindness, persistence, and the unexpected ways that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences in the world. The story of Marcus Holloway and Claire Richardson became part of local folklore, told and retold in variations that emphasized different aspects of its meaning, but always returned to the central theme of how small acts of generosity could generate transformative consequences. The oak tree became a landmark that symbolized hope and renewal, visited by families who drove hundreds of miles to see the place where kindness had literally fallen from the sky. Local schools incorporated Marcus's story into their curriculum, using it to teach students about agricultural history, rural economics, and the importance of community support during difficult times. The tale became particularly popular among guidance counselors, who used it to illustrate how unexpected opportunities could emerge from situations that initially appeared hopeless. Claire's documentary series continued to feature rural families across America, each episode building on the foundation that Marcus's story had established. The production company created a nonprofit arm that provided ongoing support to featured families, ensuring that the documentaries generated lasting benefits rather than temporary publicity. The success of Forgotten Foundations spawned similar programs that connected urban resources with rural needs, creating a network of mutual support that strengthened both communities. Years passed, and the oak tree grew taller and stronger, its canopy expanding to provide shade for an increasingly diverse array of visitors who came to hear Marcus tell his story in person. He had become an unofficial ambassador for rural renewal, speaking at conferences and universities about the importance of preserving agricultural heritage while adapting to contemporary challenges. The farm itself evolved into something that would have amazed his grandfather, a working agricultural operation that also served as an educational center, event venue, and symbol of what was possible when communities rallied around shared values. Marcus had learned to balance respect for tradition with openness to innovation, maintaining the farming practices that had sustained his family while incorporating modern techniques that ensured environmental sustainability. During harvest season, volunteers from nearby cities arrived to help with the work, urban families who wanted their children to understand where food came from and how it reached their tables. These visits created lasting friendships that bridged the gap between rural and urban communities, fostering understanding that benefited everyone involved. The financial support that had saved the farm in its darkest hour had been wisely invested in improvements that generated ongoing revenue streams. Marcus had diversified beyond traditional crops to include specialty products that appealed to farmers markets and restaurants seeking locally sourced ingredients. The farm's success had inspired neighboring operations to pursue similar strategies, creating a regional renaissance that attracted national attention. Claire visited annually to document the farm's continued growth and to maintain the friendship that had grown from their professional relationship. Her career had flourished as a result of the documentary series, leading to opportunities that took her around the world, but she always returned to the Ohio farm that had launched her most successful project. During one such visit, she found Marcus training his teenage son to operate the same tractor that had been broken down on the day they first met. The machine had been completely rebuilt with donated funds and volunteer labor, transformed from a symbol of mechanical failure into a reliable tool that would serve another generation of Holloway farmers. "It's amazing how everything comes full circle," Claire observed, watching father and son work together with the easy coordination that came from shared purpose and mutual respect. Marcus smiled and wiped grease from his hands with a rag that looked remarkably similar to the one he had used years earlier when her drone first crashed into his oak tree. "My grandfather always said that farming teaches you about cycles, about how endings become beginnings, and how what seems like failure often contains the seeds of success." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tour group, urban families who had driven from Columbus to see the famous oak tree and hear the story that had inspired their own community service projects. Marcus had grown comfortable with such interruptions, understanding that sharing his experience was part of his responsibility to the movement that had saved his farm. As he led the visitors toward the oak tree, Claire remained behind to film the interaction between rural host and urban guests, documenting the ongoing dialogue that her original documentary had initiated. The conversations that took place beneath the spreading branches covered topics ranging from sustainable agriculture to rural economics to the importance of preserving family traditions in a rapidly changing world. The visitors left with renewed appreciation for rural life and concrete ideas about how they could support similar families in their own regions. Many would return home to start community gardens, support local farmers markets, or contribute to organizations that assisted struggling agricultural operations. The ripple effects of Marcus's story continued to expand, touching lives in ways that neither he nor Claire could have anticipated during their first meeting. That evening, as the sun set behind the restored barn and the oak tree's shadow stretched across the yard, where children played games that had entertained rural families for generations, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from near despair to purposeful abundance. The transformation had required more than financial assistance. It had demanded personal growth, community support, and the courage to trust in possibilities that seemed too good to be true. The bank notice that had once threatened foreclosure now resided in a frame on his office wall, not as a reminder of past struggles, but as testimony to the power of perseverance when combined with unexpected opportunities. Below it hung the photograph of the drone rescue that had initiated his story's transformation, capturing the moment when simple kindness had opened doors to extraordinary change. Claire's original business card sat in the same frame, its edges worn from handling, but its message still clear. Stories worth telling. The phrase had become Marcus's personal motto, reminding him that every life contained narratives that deserve preservation and sharing. That individual experiences contributed to collective understanding, and that ordinary people could generate extraordinary impact through their choices and actions. The Holloway Farm's success had attracted attention from agricultural colleges, which sent students to study the combination of traditional methods and innovative approaches that had made the operation both profitable and sustainable. Marcus enjoyed teaching young people about farming, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations, while encouraging them to develop new solutions for contemporary challenges. These interactions kept him connected to emerging trends in agriculture, while reminding him of the timeless principles that had guided successful farmers for centuries. Hard work, careful observation, respect for the land, and willingness to adapt when circumstances required change. The students often commented on the oak tree's symbolic importance, understanding intuitively that it represented something larger than its immediate function as shade provider and wildlife habitat. The tree had become a gathering place for important conversations, a natural amphitheater where Marcus shared his experiences with visitors who arrived seeking inspiration, guidance, or simply confirmation that positive change remained possible in an often discouraging world. The stories told beneath its branches created a living archive of rural wisdom that complemented the formal documentation provided by Claire's continuing film work. Local media had picked up on the oak tree's significance, featuring it in articles about rural tourism and community development that attracted even more visitors to the farm. Marcus had learned to balance his desire for privacy with his responsibility to share lessons that might help other struggling families, finding satisfaction in the knowledge that his story continued to generate positive outcomes long after its original telling. The success of the Holloway farm had ripple effects throughout the surrounding community, as neighboring operations adopted similar strategies and attracted their own support networks. The region that had once seemed destined for agricultural decline had become a model for rural renewal, attracting investment, tourism, and media attention that benefited everyone involved. Marcus served on various committees and boards that promoted rural development, using his experience to guide policy decisions and resource allocation. He had discovered that his story gave him credibility with both rural and urban audiences, allowing him to bridge divides that often prevented effective collaboration between different communities. The responsibilities that came with his newfound prominence sometimes felt overwhelming, but Marcus had learned to view them as natural extensions of the gratitude he felt for his own rescue from seemingly impossible circumstances. If his experience could help other families avoid foreclosure, preserve their land, and maintain their agricultural heritage, then sharing that experience became a moral obligation rather than merely a personal choice. Claire's most recent visit had brought news that the documentary series would be adapted for international distribution, carrying the message of rural resilience to audiences around the world who faced similar challenges in their own agricultural communities. The universal themes of family, tradition, perseverance, and community support translated across cultural boundaries, creating connections between rural families, separated by continents but united by common experiences. The prospect of global reach both thrilled and humbled Marcus, who had never imagined that his personal struggles would resonate with farmers in distant countries facing their own battles against economic pressure, environmental challenges, and social change. The correspondence he received from international viewers revealed that the fundamental issues affecting rural communities were remarkably similar regardless of geography, suggesting that solutions developed in one location could potentially benefit families everywhere. As autumn approached once again and the anniversary of Claire's first visit drew near, Marcus prepared for another round of media attention, speaking engagements, and visitors who wanted to see the oak tree where the story ball had begun. The routine had become familiar over the years, but it never lost its meaning or its power to inspire both him and his audiences. The farm bustled with activity as harvest time approached, the fields golden with crops that would feed families across the region, while generating the income that ensured the Holloway legacy would continue into another generation. The children who played beneath the oak tree would grow up secure in the knowledge that their heritage was valued, their community was strong, and their future held possibilities. Their parents had almost lost the chance to provide On the evening before Claire's scheduled arrival for the annual documentary update, Marcus climbed the oak tree one last time, not to rescue expensive equipment, but to gain the perspective that height provided on the landscape of his transformed life. From 30 feet above the ground, he could see the entirety of his thriving operation, the neighboring farms that had followed his example toward renewal, and the distant lights of communities that had learned to value rural contributions to their collective prosperity. The view reminded him that individual stories were threads in a larger tapestry, that personal struggles contributed to universal understanding, and that simple acts of kindness could generate consequences that extended far beyond their original intentions. His rescue of Claire's drone had been motivated by nothing more complicated than neighborly helpfulness, but it had evolved into a legacy that would influence lives for generations to come. The oak tree swayed gently in the evening breeze, its branches reaching toward stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human endeavors, but had rarely seen such a complete transformation from despair to hope. The drone rescue that had seemed like such a minor incident had proven to be the pivotal moment that separated Marcus's story from tragedy and guided it toward triumph. As he descended from the tree for the final time in this narrative, Marcus carried with him the satisfaction of someone whose life had found its proper purpose, whose struggles had generated meaning beyond personal survival, and whose story had become part of the larger conversation about preserving what was valuable while embracing what was necessary. The Holloway farm would continue to thrive, the oak tree would continue to grow, and the message of rural resilience would continue to inspire families who needed to believe that renewal remained possible even in their darkest hours. The story that had begun with a crashed drone and a kind gesture had become a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of community support, and the extraordinary potential that lay hidden within Preth. Ordinary moments of choice. Marcus Holloway had climbed a tree to help a stranger and discovered that sometimes the greatest rescues were mutual, that sometimes salvation came disguised as opportunity, and that sometimes the most important stories were the ones that began with simple acts of kindness and ended with transformed lives reaching toward unlimited possibility.